Hello, everyone. You have made it. Welcome to our final class and final week of the course for this semester. So I hope that you have been learning and maybe not necessarily enjoying the learning, but appreciating some of the learning. So I do recognize that, the beginning of the course, I really tried to organize this course in a way where you are given some of the historical background of psychedelics and entheogens, plant medicine, whatever term makes the most sense to you, or terms that make the most sense to you. And then going into some of the, individual psychedelics in terms of MDMA, psilocybin, and ketamine, and painting a picture of its efficacy, because I come from the scientific background with this, so I do have a specific lens. I do not have experience in terms of indigenous practices. I do not have experiential experience in that. So I read several of your journals on how the documentary affected you in terms of some of the ways in which this field can be abusive. And I really want to encourage all of you to be critical in your thinking. So to many of you, this is an introductory course to this field. So many of you had no understanding of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy prior to this course. And as I said, I painted a picture of efficacy because that is what we're seeing in the data for our study, for the studies that are being conducted globally. And like any field, this field has the potential for people to enter it and exploit and harm people. So just a note to those of you who have sentiments like, I thought that I really appreciated this field and I thought I was doing good things, and then I saw this documentary and now it's changed my mind. Just know you're in a field that has the Tuskegee syphilis project in its history. The most exploitative, the most abusive, the most egregious, harmful, disgusting use of science in American history in many ways in the psychology field or in the healthcare field. So we have ethics boards because of the Tuskegee syphilis study. Or experiment. And for those of you who are not familiar with that, when you go through any sort of IRB training or ethical training, you will learn about it. But it was basically where they took African Americans in Tuskegee, Alabama, and under the guise that they were being given this treatment that was supposed to benefit them, but they gave syphilis to 400 African Americans, and they just wanted the researchers just wanted to see what's the natural course of syphilis. And these individuals who we see as subhuman, less than human, maybe not even human, they don't matter. So we'll give it to them. And if they die, it's for the betterment of everyone else. So I feel passionate about sharing that with you because our healthcare system has a really, really ugly history, a shameful history. And this field of psychedelics is no different. There are therapists, mental health therapists, who exploit, abuse, stalk their clients. I mean, we have a history in our field of conversion therapy. That is where we decided as a field that being gay is something that needs to be removed from a human's identity. So I'm feeling really passionate today. So I wanted to also end this course on a note of looking to the future. So I wanted to assign you some readings about, what is existing in this field in terms of inclusion, diversity, equity, justice, and what direction the field is taking, and the recognition that not everybody is on the same page about where we should go. And there are many people like me who are nervous about what this field may look like in 10 to 20 years with this push for pharmaceuticalization, medicalization of this substance that has such a rich history. So that's what we'll be covering this week. All right, so the first reading that I want to cover is Making Psychedelics into Medicines, the Politics and Paradoxes of Medicalization. So I pulled this graphic from the same place where I pulled, oh shoot, I didn't realize that this little icon was in the way. But I pulled this from the same place where I pulled the timeline of psychedelics that I think I showed you in it was week 2 or 3. But really thinking about the medicalization, the politics behind this, and looking at each of the psychedelics, 2 of them that we covered in this course, but MDMA is right there with psilocybin and DMT and LSD and ibogaine in terms of its scheduling. So we see ayahuasca is unrestricted in the United States. Everything else is Schedule 1 with the exception of ketamine, which is ironic because it does have the highest abuse potential. But then you can see the bioavailability onset period of each of these. And then the duration. So the duration of psilocybin SAR that it's covered is 4 to 6 hours. And you can see that ketamine and LSD here have the longest active periods, but we have also created a way of a type of ketamine that only lasts about an hour in terms of its duration. And that's how that has become available in clinics, because it fits into our current psychotherapy approach in terms of those 50-minute sessions. So it fits into this managed care system. The rest of these substances do not fit into that, and we'll talk a little bit about that and the implications of that. Okay, so with this article, first it talked about how there's a psychedelic community, but there's a lot of people who are part of the psychedelic community. And you can see even in this list that I've provided you of the different intentions, concerns of each of these groups. So for example, scientific researchers, I will never forget, if anybody wants to look it up, you can just Google my name on YouTube and see the talk that myself and my postdoc mentor, Dr. Peter Hendricks, gave at the Horizons conference in New York City. I know I've talked about this before, and I can't remember if I've shared this story. It was just a very poignant moment for me, kind of a baby researcher in this field. And at the end of our talk, so I'm used to going to conferences where I am talking to fellow researchers or fellow clinicians. With psychedelic conferences, the majority of the people who are there are people who are not doing research or clinical work. They are there because they like psychedelics and they want to support any movement toward the legalization, decriminalization, further dissemination of the substances. So at the end of our talk, because we are, DEA approved, IRB approved, workers essentially for this. So as researchers, we cannot and do not condone the recreational use of any psychedelics. So as soon as I said that, there was a boo that went across, I got booed while I was on stage. And I didn't realize necessarily who I was speaking to, but I think that really speaks to the divide in many ways. I mean, scientific researchers, then you think of shamans and indigenous healers, and the different lenses that we have, and the different approaches that we have. And then we have festival goers, therapists. We're all very different, but I got booed in saying that because I was seen, I think, as, you know, just an extension of the man, when in no way am I. But I also recognize as a researcher the importance of what we've been talking about all semester in terms of setting and integration, and the serious harms and or risks, I'll say risks, the risks in using recreationally in terms of not being completely sure about the purity of the substance that you are taking, potentially not being in an environment that is supportive of you having a beneficial, positive experience. And not that psychedelics have to be positive all the time, because we know the benefits of them being a little bit difficult, but in the space, sharing a space with somebody who's got your back, who you trust, who's been with you, that makes all the difference in terms of having an experience that can be beneficial. So starting off, kind of, you know, setting the stage for who is a part of this. And then they talk a lot about the history in terms of, you know, how we've come to this second wave and the controversies and methodological errors that happened in the first wave of the research. And then also this media, in some ways, media pushing the positive effects of psychedelics, but as y'all saw also in the documentary, the risks of that. And in some ways, as we know, the media cherry picks a little bit, you know, what was shown in that documentary was absolutely valid. It is also the minority in terms of experiences. That doesn't diminish any of the validity of the experiences. We also know that what media does in many ways is sensationalizes outliers. So the mainstream acceptance of psychedelics has really you know, helped push its popularity. But in terms of, you know, are we ready for this expansion, for the medicalization, for the pharmaceuticalization, for the commercialization of this? That's really what they're talking about in this. And what we know about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, it is a blending of medication and psychotherapy, but then there's tension in that, in terms of, you know, what do we do as therapists? We work from what's called a wellness model. We look at the inherent strengths in individuals, and we look at any sort of like symptomology that we are seeing with the client. And then we say, how does this make sense? Which ultimately, hopefully, is, you know, more of a trauma-informed lens. And then the medical model, which is where drugs lie in terms of pharmaceutical companies, they look at what are the symptoms, what can we do to only focus on the symptoms. So it's this coming together of these two, you know, ontological differences in terms of how therapists see suffering or struggle, and then how medical personnel see that. So I will say, as couple and family therapists, you know, we're pretty far on the wellness model, so are counselors. And then as you go, social workers as well, but then as you come into psychologists, psychiatrists, they are a little bit more, they lean a little bit more in terms of the medical model. So there is some need to come together of that. And then right now there's you know, psychedelics are seen as a path for people to make lots of money. So Compass Pathways, a company that we talked about, I think in week 2, that was when John Oliver talked about it on Last Week Tonight. In terms of, this is a pharmaceutical company, a for-profit pharmaceutical company that is synthesizing a specific strand or type of psilocybin, wanting to trademark that and own it. So then if anybody uses it, they make the money. And you know, same deal in many ways with MAPS. I mean, MDMA is different than psilocybin because psilocybin is a naturally occurring substance. MDMA is a created substance. But in many ways, you know, MAPS wants to be at the forefront of pushing psychedelics being available for use. But then the direction that we're going is potentially where, you know, just the people who can afford it can access it, because this is potentially, again, with the pharmaceuticalization, going into a privatized lane, where we know how that works in the United States. Privatized medicine is not accessible to generally the people who could benefit the most from that. Yeah, okay. So medicalization and psychedelics, medicalization, it shapes human problems as medical issues for study and treatment. So again, we're looking at humans not necessarily as humans, but as their symptoms. And when we think about medicine, when we pop a pill or inject something or snuff something or, put something in our body to assist in the healing of something inside, we're not thinking about the human, we're thinking about, addressing the issue that they're having. So in terms of, they talked about why medicalization now, and the question is, why are psychedelics becoming popular or maintaining their popularity, is really in many ways because pharmaceutical companies haven't made medications that are helpful for really any of the mental health struggles that psychedelics are addressing. Like I said, in our study with cocaine use disorder, there is no drug for cocaine use disorder to help counter cravings or possible overdose or anything like that. Yes, so some challenges in the discontinuities. There's disparities between clinical research and participant experiences. So we're not necessarily, well, as we've read, the picture in many ways that's being painted about psychedelics is that it's magic. It's this magic cure. And that, and again, this is largely a narrative that is pushed by people who are not part of Indigenous communities, research communities. This is more so pushed by people who are potentially in this field with like a master's, like an MBA, or somebody who's like on a marketing team, because again, there's this movement toward the commercialization, which again, to me, terrifying. But there's this narrative that's being pushed of like, this is a cure-all, it's like a magic bullet. If you have treatment-resistant depression or treatment-resistant PTSD, ketamine is your go-to, MDMA is going to change your life. And I'm not saying that these aren't stories that are very true to some participants, but with this narrative, and then if participants are coming into these experiences, expecting this quantum change every single time, that does set up the field for some disappointment, because just like any other approach, it may not work for everybody. And again, I can't stress enough the importance of set and setting in all of this, and the relationship that we build with our participants, with our clients, with our patients, because at the end of the day, the substance, I think, is just a small piece of what this psychedelic assisted psychotherapy has to offer. And so in terms of integration, many of the studies that are done, they have at most 4 integration sessions. And as we read in several of the articles, when participants are asked, or even kind of tangentially shared or anecdotally shared, that they really wish that they had some further support. That again, it's not, they weren't like, okay, I was struggling with the addiction, popped a pill of psilocybin, and then I was like, oh, life is great. I mean, it's the same as, I have trauma, I did 1 session of EMDR and now my life is completely different. Like, no, you need time to integrate the insights and the other things that come up, which I really appreciate about this, what was stated in this article, because it really does talk about the importance of better understanding the long-term possible challenges with a psychedelic experience. Because so this person, for example, is under the influence of this substance for like 4 to 12 hours, depending on the substance. And their life is potentially, like in that moment, their life is fundamentally different. Their experience is fundamentally different. And then once the effects of the substance wear off, they're back in this environment in terms of like structural inequities, racial inequities, violence, harm, exploitation, abuse, microaggressions, which doesn't necessarily come out in the data. One, because I don't think we do enough longitudinal studies, and two, because of one of the things we've talked about and read about this week in terms of the homogeneity of the participant pools, largely male, largely white, largely educated, largely higher SES. These are individuals who aren't aware or aren't really affected by structural inequities, racial inequities, microaggressions, sexism, homophobia, transphobia. That's not going to be a part of the data because that's not a part of their story. So we also have to understand, how do we navigate these realities of individuals who live with these inequities, who are affected by these inequities and these, again, microaggressions, abuses, exploitations, harms, violence, and do psychedelics work for that too? So in this article, I talk about a pharmacon-like property where it is both a poison and a cure. It helps out with some things, and then it also exposes other things. I think about that in terms of what we do with psychotherapy. There's a reason we say insight isn't enough. And in some cases, in many cases, initially insight is super distressing. I mean, just think about it when in the case of like families, when just remember the day, if you were ever like me. So again, I might be also, I'm speaking from a very specific lens, potentially a very privileged lens. I remember the day I realized my family was fucked up. And that was a really distressing day. To go from thinking my family is great at communicating, we're supportive of one another, to like, holy shit, I have not been getting my needs met. So sitting in that insight without anything to do with it is extremely difficult. So think about a person who is, affected by these larger structures, and then this potentially overwhelming sense of helplessness, of, okay, I know that there's these abusive structures and I'm just one person. How do I navigate this stuff? Or I saw in my psychedelic experience this this possibility of, or this vision of an equitable world, an equal world. And I'm back in this place of the reality of this extremely unequal, inequitable world. How do you help that? How do you support a person in navigating something like that? So medicalization, the role of regulators, as we know, the FDA has granted MDMA, a breakthrough status in 2017, psilocybin breakthrough status in 2019, which basically meant that it could expedite the process toward approval, because they're seeing the benefits of this. And then thinking about, because many of these studies, as we know, when we go through the different phases, we add more and more people. So, these pilot studies or these feasibility studies, very small ends, 4 to 10 people in these studies, just to see, does it work? Can we enlarge this to include more people? But then the question is always scalability. And in the, article that we read about, we will call it Paula, or Paula, I'm not sure. That scalability can be really harmful in terms of diluting, solid approaches for the monetization, for financial gain, and really ultimately, what is the most expensive part of psychedelic assisted therapy is the human resources. And if there's a way for people who are in it in terms of investors, people who are wanting to push this in terms of profit margins, they're going to try to figure out how to eliminate the most expensive part of this, which is people. And if you think about the history of psychedelics, plant medicines and theogens is what they have historically been called, the human element cannot be understated in terms of its importance. So that is a big fear, again, in the expansion, scalability, monetization, commercialization, pharmaceuticalization, medicalization of this, is we're getting further and further away from the roots of how these substances came to be. And then, they talk about in terms of access and standardization, can we add questions for marginalized groups in terms of access and, a limitation in terms of accessibility and applicability, relevance in many ways are these standardized protocols. So as we know, randomized controlled trial, they are the gold standard of any sort of research on testing a new intervention, approach, medication, whatever it is. And standardized means you give the same thing to everybody. And one of the things I just think about this in terms of academia, it's a place we're all in. More and more institutions are recognizing the harm in requiring standardized testing for admissions, because has been shown again and again that there are particular groups who consistently score lower on these standardized tests because they are not culturally relevant. They are not applicable. These are standardized to a very colonized mindset, a white mindset. So they disproportionately disadvantage certain populations. So why would standardized protocols not be the same in terms of their risks? So psychedelics already are medicines, seen as medicines, particularly in indigenous populations and with shamanism. So one of the things that they talked about in this article was a push toward decriminalization and legalization, and the possibility that the psychedelic movement might even be harming that because of some things like psychedelic exceptionalism. So psychedelics are sometimes seen as different from other drugs, hindering drug policy reform. I am definitely guilty of this. I know I've mentioned it in my recordings before this one. Psychedelics do work on the brain differently. Psychedelics are different in terms of their potential for abuse. The risk in seeing psychedelics as exceptions is that one, it can hinder the work that we're doing in terms of demonizing some substances, like, I don't know what it would be. I was going to say evangelizing, but I don't think that's the right word, like idealizing other substances. But it continues the divide, right? Another thing that we read about this week in the articles is that like psychedelic use in white populations is experimental. It's fun. It's part of hippie culture. Psychedelic use in communities of color is a crime. So say it's, as we talked about with the opioid epidemic, as we read about with the opioid epidemic, it became an issue when middle America was affected by it. So just thinking about, these narratives around drug use and how the narrative of psychedelics being an exception will absolutely harm the movement toward decriminalization, legalization, because it will just be medicalized. It will be like, okay, all of the rest of these drugs still super bad, but psychedelics, you can use them in medical settings. But if you use them recreationally, which people who don't have access to things like healthcare, a disposable income, they will be using this recreationally, and it will continue to be there will continue to be punitive repercussions for that use. So, because as we know, the war on drugs, complete bullshit. We need drug policy reform, but I don't think we're recognizing the harm in the narratives that are around psychedelics and how there is this split. If we're going to do decriminalization and legalization with substances, like, in my opinion, decriminalize and legalize all of them. Honestly, legalize on all of them, because decriminalization to me is not far enough. Okay, so some challenges. So in terms of regulating diverse contexts, there's advocates who emphasize the importance of innovative and community-based drug regulations. One of the things we also read about this week was harm reduction. Is there, can we, I'm curious about what we think about things like clean needle exchanges, safe injection sites, even in terms of harm reduction with treatment of substance use disorders. Harm reduction abstinence-based models can be a part of harm reduction, but when we think about substances, we usually think about, you should use none, like abstinence is the only way, because that's largely, for example, what AA believes, and that's a really prominent mutual aid program. And so when we think about harm reduction and individuals who just want to reduce using, we usually see that as not enough. And then, like I talked about, the psychedelic exceptionalism obstacle, some view psychedelics differently, hindering efforts for decriminalization and legalization. Hopefully how I explained it makes sense. And then like I've said before, setting purity and mode of administration really impact drug effects. So that is a reason why I, as a researcher and somebody who is wanting to have this disseminated in a safe, accessible way, can't advocate for recreational use, primarily for purity. Adulterated substances are what kill people. Okay, so equity and policy, just in terms of, we need some equity provisions in drug policy. And remember, equity means that, different people need different things. So just thinking about what do different communities, what do different, subcultures within the culture need, and how do we implement policies that are relevant to and supportive of different communities. And then, as I talked about before, the drug use perceptions, it's racially stratified despite common use of psychedelics alongside other drugs. Psychedelics, again, recreationally, psychedelics are like very rarely used just on their own. So that's another risk in this. I can't remember if I said it in this class, but when I think about like the mixing of drugs and how deadly they can be, I think about individuals who use cocaine and also drink alcohol. When you have both of those substances in your body, because I just think about this, like when you go out to the club, plenty of people are doing cocaine and also drinking to potentiate or like prolong the effects of cocaine. And when you mix those two substances together, it creates a byproduct called cocaethylene, which is lethal. And that's the reason why, many people, for example, like die on their 21st birthday, and they will say it's from an overdose, but it's not from just the alcohol or just the cocaine, but it's the combination of the two. So we also don't necessarily know how psychedelics play with other substances. And also like how much of other substances are in adulterated psychedelics. So just, some things to keep in mind there. And then talking about this both and approach that the authors proposed, medicalization versus decriminalization, there's a relationship, as hopefully I articulated earlier, of, if we're wanting to medicalize psychedelics and decriminalize it in terms of for medical use, that still means it's criminalized for recreational use. So that's already where we're struggling. So what's the point in that, in terms of like, that's not moving the needle anywhere. And then some challenging myths. Medicalization efforts challenge myths about drugs, but should also address harm against demonized communities, again, primarily communities of color. I would argue also like LGBTQ plus communities in terms of, you know, party drugs and yeah. So there's state by state, as we know, because there are no substances that are federally legal. It's all state by state. I say that slowly. I think I'm right. So state legal medical marijuana, for example, programs have resulted in minor changes in criminal justice policy. So, you know, we're not seeing the effects of these policy changes, which indicates that we need to go a step further in terms of actually making a change. And then bifurcated schedules where medicalization may create separate schedules for drug products and substances. Like I said, so if psychedelics are seen as a drug, and then other substances are seen as, or I'm sorry, like drug as in like it can be prescribed, which we know like can absolutely be abused, but then we have substances, then we're just furthering this divide, which ultimately just doesn't help. In this article, they also talked about how, you know, Adderall and Ritalin are basically the same as other opioids, but one is seen as okay, and then the other is criminalized. And what happens when people can't get their prescribed drugs or drugs that they know are helpful, they tend to go like kind of off market, you know, they go underground, they go black market style. I mean, even probably the term black market is rooted in something, I'm guessing, harmful or stigmatizing. And so there's this, then this would only further perpetuate criminalization. There's some good drugs and some bad drugs, and we're going to continue to criminalize the bad drugs. And then here, unsupervised use versus treatments. There's a division between, quote, good users and abusers that can hinder broader decriminalization efforts. And again, this has historically been racially informed because any substance that we use in a medical setting can be abused, and every drug of abuse has a medical use. So that's the intertwined nature of these narratives. So there is incentivization for diluted therapies. Like I said, when we scale, we have to cut costs, and to cut costs, we have to cut the purity, we have to cut the human resources. So the way that these treatments are even being studied currently may not be what hits market, because we're trying to scale. So that means, again, potentially individuals entering the field who have not been screened appropriately, who do not have the appropriate training. And that doesn't always mean that the individuals who have, for example, like a master's in some sort of mental health are the best people for that. But how do we reliably train individuals? How do we recruit? How do we screen? And then how do we train individuals who could really be beneficial? But then how do we also compensate these individuals in a fair way and keep this treatment accessible? These are all really difficult questions if we're wanting to scale something like psychedelic therapy. High financial stakes, financial interest may prolong debates over efficacy, similar to issues with approved antidepressants. You know, at the end of the day, the man has to make a dollar, right? So how do we convince the people in power to focus on the health of humans rather than filling pockets? It's the quintessential struggle living in a capitalistic system. the institutionalization of access to previously illicit drugs for powerful demographics may deprioritize decriminalization efforts, like I talked about before. And then, as we know, there's a misalignment of scheduling and sentencing. There's plenty of people of color predominantly incarcerated right now for nonviolent crimes. It is, as we know, it is essentially new Jim Crow era, where there is still enslavement of individuals. And the loophole, as we know, is ultimately the 13th Amendment. So just thinking about our history as a country, and I know that this expands beyond the United States. I'm talking primarily here about the United States, but also thinking about emphasizing community-based resources. Community-based efforts are crucial for decriminalization and harm reduction alongside medicalization. So if medicalization is imminent, which I think it is, we also have to have parallel efforts to decrease, honestly, many of the reasons why people need to come to treatment in the first place. Okay, so looking at some conclusions from this article. So emphasizing context, we need to recognize the importance of the wider set and setting in psychedelic medicalization. Again, set is mindset. And this is also thinking about, like, when we talked about matrix in the first week of this class. Remember, that's like the social set. What does society think about this? And then setting, are we creating a supportive social environment for this? I would argue no, we're not there yet. Community-based support, we need to integrate experiences beyond controlled trials through community efforts. You know, these are also, this is the, to me, psychedelics right now, this is the epitome of efficacy versus effectiveness. So as we know, efficacy, this is a step toward effectiveness. We are only in efficacy testing right now for psychedelics because it's not effective. We don't know the effectiveness yet, because the difference between efficacy and effectiveness is that efficacy is in like lab settings, kind of controlled, perfectly controlled settings, which isn't really necessarily realistic. And then effectiveness is doing this in the community. You know, I think about this in terms of like outpatient treatments where, you know, individuals learn tools to then go out into the world and navigate the world. But we're not there yet. So that's where the community efforts is really important. We know that there's a dominance of large capital-backed efforts. Large corporations influence the public discourse and research design. Money talks, as we know. And then medicalization as a social pharmacon. So again, that poison and cure. It promises accessibility, but may reduce the diversity and plasticity of psychedelic experiences. Again, this is in potentially diluted substances, you know, meaning that they're just not as powerful. And in terms of, you know, accessibility of individuals due to things like disposable income insurance. Okay, so the psychedelic renaissance, the next article that we read, or another article that we read, is the psychedelic renaissance and the limitations of white dominant medical framework, a call for indigenous and ethnic minority inclusion. So same deal here. We know about the roots. I'm just making notes for you so you can refer to this in terms of some spark notes for the readings. But the one I want to focus on here is systemic inequities. Despite some efforts to involve Indigenous communities, few people of color have benefited from psychedelic research participation, perpetuating systemic inequities. We read in multiple articles that over 80% of participants in published studies in randomized controlled trials are white, which comes with a specific lived experience. It's not a homogeneous lived experience. There's, you know, a diversity of experiences within groups, but it says something about how we're going about recruiting, how we're going about retaining, and how we're going about hearing from individuals who are not white. So we talked about, or you read about the different healing practices. plant-based psychedelics, or ultimately, you know, with indigenous healers, are really called plant-based entheogens, have been integral in spiritual practices of indigenous communities worldwide. We know that Africa, Central America, North America, South America. There's sacred rituals with psychoactive plants, with religion and spiritual rituals. Entheogens versus psychedelics. Some modern researchers prefer the term entheogens to recognize the sacred and spiritual context of indigenous medicine. Then we learned about the different substances that were covered in this article. Ayahuasca, psilocybin, peyote, and ibogaine all have indigenous roots. So traditional healing practices continued here. Ayahuasca, well, I'm not going to go into this in detail because I did go into this in a lot of detail in previous recordings and in your previous readings. But really what I want to emphasize here is the sacredness of these substances. And yes, like ketamine, MDMA, they're not plants. Were created in labs, so they don't have the history. But I really want to emphasize to you again, the set and setting part of psychedelics. Integration, super duper important. But I'm just talking about leading up to the experience and how important we are as people in that, and how central to traditional indigenous healing practices that the human element is. So just thinking about, you know, an overview of the brief history of psychedelic medicine. So this is what's considered the first wave, there was psychotherapy exploration. Initially they examined whether psychedelic drugs could facilitate psychotherapy and accelerate the treatment process, but there were some research flaws, methodological flaws, lack of control groups, difficulty distinguishing drug-related effects from psychotherapy effects, which ultimately, I think we'll continue to have that difficulty, but who am I? And then unethical practices, we know that in terms of increased media coverage, focusing on unethical practices. I think about this in terms of a difference with, indigenous healing belief systems, where it's integral that the shaman, the guide, the curandera, uses along with the individuals who are, part of the healing ritual, because it is a connection to the, animism, to the larger spiritual forces that influence the shaman in order to, appropriately or more beneficially, effectively, I don't think that would be a term anybody in indigenous communities would use, but heal the individual who is coming for, that reason. But, these unethical practices, when we think about this from Western standards of, we should not be under the influence when we are working with individuals with psychedelics. So, and then also just like using recreationally, not under any sort of supervision, exploiting participants in terms of also having sexual relationships with them. So just, lots of not good things happening in the first wave. And then there was, then the federal funding dried up for this, and there was a decline in research. If there's not money to pursue in it, no one's going to do it. So now we're in our second wave, and this began around, the 1990s, 2000s to now. And then, we have improved research standards. So we're trying to address the concerns from the first wave. They're double-blind studies, placebo-controlled, they're randomized. There's a focus on set and setting and making sure that the treatment is efficacious. We have enhanced safety guidelines. And ultimately, this is resulting, the results of this are promising. So cultural forces that have led to unequal access, we have indigenous and ethnic minority voices. Practitioners from indigenous and ethnic minority groups are often detached from the second wave. They talked about, for example, the Detroit conference, where there were largely, I think, exclusively African-American researchers who are largely unknown in the larger psychedelic space, because, maybe they're not the ones that are doing research that is highly cited or that is highly published or something like that. So, they just don't have the voice. Cultural appropriation, Western psychedelic science sometimes appropriates indigenous healing methodologies without proper acknowledgement or connection to the original producers of the knowledge. Talking a lot about women, people of color, and female people of color who have not been given the credit that they deserve in terms of how psychedelics even really kind of came to be where they are. I think about Maria Sabina, who brought Wasson into an indigenous healing ceremony. And then he basically published this big article on that, and was given lots of acknowledgement and lots of credence for that, where Maria Sabina really wasn't acknowledged or given any credit. So there's oppressive social forces. White dominant culture often recontextualizes indigenous truths, perpetuating systemic injustices and traumatizing indigenous people, further marginalizing their voices, thinking about like, these are the indigenous people have these beautiful healing rituals. And like, basically in many ways, it's like, they have access to this thing that's healing. So like, we don't have to work on any of the systemic reasons as to why indigenous people are struggling or suffering. And not that that's happening all the time. So there's like, of course, indigenous joy and things like that. But it really does, when you think about things like resilience, just the reason why people have to be resilient, that's what we should be focusing on. But when we hyper individualize people's experiences, we think of, indigenous individuals, they've overcome so much. People of color in the United States have overcome so much. They're so resilient. They got this. And then we don't have to, then what that does is ultimately remove the responsibility to, to me, like abolish and what's the word I'm looking for? Like take down these structures of inequity that continue to disproportionately disadvantage and harm individuals. So when we think about resilience, I think it is absolutely weaponized, and it allows people to turn the other way. So the hippie counterculture, this appropriated aspects of Black culture, including psychedelic drug use, while excluding people of color and reinforcing racial stereotypes. Surprise, surprise. And then white dominant culture, how we conduct psychedelic science, it functions within a Western medicalized framework, and it replicates existing power structures and limits the inclusion of people of color in its advancements. So again, it replicates it and in some ways exacerbates it, perpetuates it, maintains it. So I just think we really, at the very least, or not the very least, to start, we need to acknowledge what we're doing to then change it. So this has several parts because there's unequal access all over the place. So racial discrepancies in the criminal justice system, we've talked about this. So, the prison population in terms of racial makeup is in no way equal to or proportionate to the general population. So we are clearly not incarcerating individuals at an equal rate. And then, as we know, people of color are more likely to be arrested, searched, and face force, leading to lack of safe spaces to explore psychedelic healing. There's a lack of protection for people of color. African Americans lack the same protection as white Americans when it comes to recreational drug use and often face harsher punishment. None of this should be a surprise to anybody. Stigma surrounding psychedelics. So there's a lack of accessibility that results in psychedelic treatments primarily being accessible among white individuals, while African Americans have limited access. And quite frankly, the exploitative and harmful, abusive history within medical settings and institutions, Black Americans have a really justified reason to not want to be a part of psychedelic treatments in the first place. I think I told you, I think I shared this story, but I'll reiterate it. you know, when I was doing my research in Alabama, in Birmingham, Alabama, not far from Selma, not far from Tuskegee, where, you know, we're part of this large institution that is that has the institution itself, like UAB in particular, does not necessarily have like a poor history in terms of treatment of individuals. Maybe I'm taking that back right now as I'm thinking. You know, I just think about UAB, for example, of like its expansion, and it's displaced many individuals who have lived around the institution. So I'm not gonna act like UAB is in any way, you know, not responsible for harm. But anyway, so I'm, you know, as part of an institution where, and then I'm one of two white researchers in a predominantly Black city. Birmingham is 70% Black. So we had difficulty recruiting individuals, and we would have people who would say, no, like, tell me for real what you're doing. You know, because again, we're not far from Tuskegee, we're not far from Selma, we're not far from places that are, you know, historical geographical places for things like the civil rights movement. So anyway, I just want to speak to the skepticism and the distrust that is squarely placed, validly placed, as to why people of color may not even want to be a part of research. So I think that, again, I can't be like, oh, we need to just encourage people of color to be part of this. Like, no, we have to take a look at ourselves as institutions, as people who are part of institutions, and say, what are we doing that is continuing to be a barrier for, you know, wanting to be a part of studies and wanting to be a part of this. You know, I just think we're, in many ways, we look in the wrong direction and we put the onus in the wrong places. So as we know, mistrust in the medical system, as I was speaking to a little bit, there's a history of unethical medical experiments and manipulation of people of color, which creates mistrust and reluctance to participate in medical trials, including psychedelic research, again, for good reason. And then part 3, a holistic shift is needed. We need to rectify unequal access. That requires a holistic shift in the perception and treatment of people of color to offer equal quality of care and accessibility. We need to acknowledge the historical mistreatment experienced by people of color and seek reconciliation. All humans should be treated equally, and no group deserves a lesser quality of treatment, which this also requires a societal change. So when we talk about this in terms of mental health, y'all, this is third order change that we are needing to provide, you know, this aspirational equal access and equal treatment, equal quality of treatment, equal access of treatment. In psychedelic science, we have to actively work to include Indigenous and ethnic minority voices to address cultural appropriation. I don't think this is something that we do very well as a field, and we have to build trust and representation, establishing trust through ethical research practices and promoting representation of people of color in psychedelic research. And I'm not just talking about participants. We need more representation in terms of leadership in the field, in terms of researchers in the field, clinicians in the field. So there just needs to be more representation all around. So current inequities, we do have racial disparities. Like I said, there were some studies that were looked at from 2000 to 2017 of psychedelic research. Only 2.2% of participants that were in these studies were Black, 2.2% Latino, 1.5% Asian, 7.4% Indigenous. The rest are white. And there's a lack of understanding of trauma. So when you don't include people of color, this results in a lack of understanding of trauma and how it uniquely affects of trauma, and it's unique to their cultural and historical experiences. So when you don't have that voice from the participant end, and then we potentially don't have that understanding from the researcher end or clinician end, that's going to be missed. And that's an extremely important part of healing, is understanding the whole human. And then a need for research on psychopathology. Psychedelic research must consider race and ethnicity in the expression and assessment of psychopathology to demonstrate efficacy for people of color. We know the DSM does a terrible job of this. Again, the DSM it's medicalized. It is standardized in many ways. Culture's like an aside that they talk about in the DSM. And this is also an issue when we're looking at, this one thing that I would like to do in my research is look at trauma, but not necessarily trauma that meets criteria for DSM, a DSM diagnosis for PTSD, because we know many of the traumas of people who have been, historically excluded, who are marginalized. They have experiences that very much are distressing, harmful, traumatic, but they are not these like acute traumas that would necessarily meet criteria. So I also think we need to think about what we're testing for this, like what are the indications of psychedelics? And I think about that, of course, in terms of our fight as couple and family therapists for, insurance coverage, for example, of like V codes and Z codes. Not everybody is they don't have necessarily a diagnosis, or they're not meeting a criteria for the diagnosis. And I don't think that's a fault of the person or the clinician, but I think it's a fault of the system that we're working in. Like the fact that we have to, whatever. I mean, I'm gonna go off because insurance is such a B. Okay, so more current inequities, to explore the potential benefits for depression, anxiety, PTSD, and substance use in communities of color. Researchers must employ culturally specific strategies to include people of color in clinical studies. We read about this in the research from a couple of weeks ago in terms of how to better recruit, retain, people of color in research studies, and that also starts with representation on the study personnel. So this also talked about representation of women and people of color. Female and people of color psychedelic scientists and therapists are often not acknowledged as leaders in the field. This is perpetuating marginalization and exclusion. And then recognizing female leaders like Kai Wingo and Mazatec native healer Maria Sabina, who I talked about earlier. They made significant contributions, but are generally they have been overlooked in historical narratives. Again, researchers of color like Claudio Naranjo have been integral in the development of psychedelic therapy, but are not always recognized. And then there's importance of Indigenous practitioners and their intimate knowledge of psychedelic substances that must be honored and included to avoid Western approaches that may threaten the medicine. And I think this is the last part of this as well. There's the possibility of focusing on universal effects rather than specific cultural, focusing on universal effects, again, the standardization, rather than specific cultural context removes the communal environment. This is perpetuating hyper-individualization and marginalizing Indigenous communities. So you just think about like what's a value, a national value? Like when we think about nationalism, what is the value of this nation? Individualism. And that is not true for all communities. So having, a strong connection to your community, having what would be, dubbed dependence from a Western lens on other members in a community, these are culturally normative, but they are pathologized in our current system. So how do we reconcile that? How do we honor that and not pathologize that? We need to prioritize inclusivity. Again, honoring Indigenous communities, finding ways to pay retribution to and honor Indigenous communities with historical ties is crucial for ethical research and practice. When we're looking at the Western medical model, attempting psychedelic healing outside of its communal environment dismisses intercultural exchange opportunities and reinforces the Western medical models. And then we need to embrace diversity in psychedelic research, leadership, and practice, and this will hopefully lead to more comprehensive and equitable approach to healing. So then they talked about addressing these inequities. This movement presents an opportunity to acknowledge existing inequities in mental health care and rectify past injustices through diverse expertise and inclusion. And then embracing diversity. True collaboration means going beyond tokenizing and seeking diverse voices for the progression of the science, fostering innovative insights and making the psychedelic renaissance accessible to all. So, you know, tokenization essentially is just like, oh, we have this person on our faculty or in our lab, that's good, you know, just like check mark. But this is, you know, taking the cultural values, the traditions, the paradigms of, you know, non-Western lens, or a colonized lens, an anti-racist lens, and using that. So it's more of like to me, it's like this spiritual shift, this soul shift in like who we are as a community, and quite frankly, as a nation. But again, I think it's outside the scope of this what I'm doing right now, lecture. Okay, so research community collaboration. You know, this is also one of the studies that talks about community-based participatory research, which is ultimately, you know, coming out of the ivory towers of institutions and academia, and truly collaborating with community members, having them be partners in the research. And hearing from the community, what do you need? Instead of me as the expert telling you what you need, why don't I shut my mouth and open my ears and hear from you what you and your community might need? You know, practicing cultural humility. This is crucial in psychedelic science, again, to avoid repeating, limiting, and unethical practices. This involves acknowledging our socialization, our ignorance of privileges, and broadening the healing framework to include diverse voices. And again, we have this unique opportunity as a field rooted in non-Western traditions. Psychedelic science has a chance to resist existing power structures, improve the lives of marginalized communities, and set an example for broader change within medicine and society, which would like what a cool opportunity to have. And I hope as a field we can do that. All right, so one of the ways that, you know, trying to kind of marry this scientific approach with also in this inclusive approach is the EQUIP framework that we read about. So this is promoting health equity and psychedelic science. So there's been a recent revival, as we know. There's been legal and regulatory changes since the first wave, which has promising results. We're at a critical juncture. So, you know, just kind of also restating what has already been talked about so far in my talk with you. So wider access to psychedelic therapies is imminent, but implementation and administration will determine accessibility for marginalized groups and vulnerable populations. And then there is this equitable approach. Incorporating the EQUIP healthcare framework includes cultural safety, harm reduction, trauma-informed care, and contextual tailoring. So this might be a way to promote health equity within psychedelic medicine. So right now we have some challenges. As we know, lack of diversity in clinical trials, majority white, educated, male, straight, there's another one, white, male, educated, higher SES, generally heterosexual, or we don't know sexuality. So, or that's, you know, that's not collected, that information is not collected. And then we have, as I've talked about before, the impact of the war on drugs, mass incarcerations of BIPOC communities due to drug offenses that are, you know, with harsher sentences, harsher treatment. There has been an appropriation of indigenous practices, and in many ways, we're getting further and further away from the roots of those. And then again, in our field, I talked about this already, you know, as a mental health field, we are by no means immune from the injustices and the harms and the exploitation, abuse of different communities, particularly LGBTQIA2+ community, with the legacy of conversion therapy and essentialist gender assumptions of psychedelic research. This must be confronted to create more inclusive and supportive environment. One of the things that we talk about and use currently in the psychedelic field is co-therapists that are binary genders. So generally a cisgender female and a cisgender male. So there's a way to be more inclusive of the LGBTQ community in terms of different gender expressions, different gender identities, different sexual orientations, and of course, you know, different other intersections of other identities that are not essentially a white man and a white woman, a white cisgender man, a white cisgender woman. And then there's the challenges of privatization. If we do privatize psychedelic medicine, which I think this is the direction we're unfortunately going right now, this could lead to financial inaccessibility and prioritize profit over population health objectives. So this necessitates a focus on equity-oriented care in development and regulation. So this is a framework that is used in Canada. That's what the .ca is. My American ass at first thought that was California. So nope, that's Canada. So if you would like to, you can click on this link in the drive where I have uploaded this PowerPoint so you can see for yourself what they're trying to do with this equity-oriented approach. So this addresses social marginalization. This approach responds to calls for equity in psychedelic medicine to ensure that advancements benefit marginalized communities, not just the mainstream. So it goes beyond the individual, looking at these social structures of inequity. And equity-oriented care dimensions focuses on cultural safety, harm reduction, trauma and violence-informed care, and contextual tailoring. And then there are organizational level interventions, which are not common in mental health or quite frankly, any health-oriented approach. So this, if we utilize it at the organizational level, this enhances capacity and system level changes, promoting equity in care. So it looks at the systems of inequity in many ways an attempt to dismantle, reform, abolish, whatever way you want to take, to change the systems that bring people into our care in the first place. So there's some tangible examples that were given. So implementing concrete resources and tools such as equity talk pocket cards, the equity oriented health care scale, which, this is all client oriented or like consumer oriented, patient oriented, where it's hearing from the patient about the quality of the care and if it's equitable. Equity walkthroughs, online training modules for staff and leaders. So I actually pulled this screenshot directly from the website. So this is, the intersection of trauma and violence-informed care, harm reduction, and substance use health, and cultural safety and anti-racism. These are the elements and dimensions of this equity-oriented healthcare approach, and it's tailored to context and responsive to inequities. And there are 10 strategies to guide organizations, such as revision the use of time, tailor care programs and services to local contexts, actively counter racism and discrimination, optimize use of place and space. So all of this is talked about in detail on the website, but this is really just an overview of the table that was provided or that was part of the reading. So these are the 4 dimensions: trauma and violence-informed care, harm reduction, cultural safety, contextually tailored care. And then I'm talking about each of these in more detail in these slides. So this trauma and violence-informed care acknowledges the intersecting effects of interpersonal and systemic violence on individuals affected by social inequities. There is always a historical context. It recognizes that medicine, mental health, and controlled substances as sites of discrimination and violence for marginalized populations. Again, none of us are immune. Even if we came into this field with beautiful intentions, you are entering into a field that has the serious possibility of harm and has had a history of harm. Enhancing safety and trust. So we're implementing measures to increase patients' sense of safety through building trust, using psychoeducation and gentle encouragement during psychedelic therapy. We're offering less intimidating, lower dose psychedelic experiences with the option to titrate or lessen. Titrate just basically means, like lessen the dose, taper off for those experiencing any sort of structural vulnerabilities, like, if macro doses cost more than micro doses, then We can still offer microdosing for somebody who might be, struggling financially or something like that, unable to pay for a macro dose, just for example. And then this dimension develops psychedelic assisted therapies to address trauma resulting from structural violence and oppression. And again, beyond the limitations of the DSM, for example, define PTSD, like I talked about. The current conceptualization of PTSD, or the criteria to meet the diagnosis of PTSD, is extremely limiting and does not give credence to things like microaggression, racial traumas, micro traumas, things like that. So then harm reduction, this involves substance users in the development process to determine their needs and how to explore how psychedelic medicine can support positive changes in their lives. I love this approach. Again, this is a key part of community-based participatory research, is hearing from the people who would be engaging in the services and what would be helpful for them. So again, instead of pulling together a panel of experts who have no lived experience in this thing, why don't we at the very least collaborate? That's ultimately what this is saying. Promote harm reduction by allowing individuals to explore the potential benefits of psychedelic medicine beyond substance use reduction, focusing on other health conditions and overall well-being. This is something that I am very committed to in my work within the psychedelics field, is continuing to humanize the individuals who specifically struggle with cocaine use disorder, and how psychedelics have, psilocybin in particular, has been helpful to them in other dimensions of their lives beyond their substance use, because they are more than just people who have struggled with cocaine use disorder. Inclusivity and comorbidity. This is an approach that meets clients where they are without making abstinence or specific diagnoses of substance use disorder prerequisites for engaging in psychedelic assisted therapy. I think there's more research that needs to be done here in terms of understanding how psychedelics interact with other substances in the body. So I think one of the reasons for this is just safety, making sure that we're being safe. So, we did, prior to our psilocybin session, the individuals in the study had to be abstinent for 7 days, just to make sure that the cocaine was fully out of their system. So we weren't having to, potentially combat any mixing of substances in the body that we don't really know how they mix. So legal and regulated access. This is supporting harm reduction by providing legal and regulated means for accessing psychedelics, reducing the risks associated with obtaining illicit substances. So coming back a little bit to the legalization, decriminalization conversation. And then pre and post experience support, utilizing a harm reduction approach to provide education, preparation, and integration support for clients before and after their psychedelic experience, optimizing benefits and reducing potential harms. Again, there is a little bit of a call at this point for extended integration, because that is something that past participants are talking about. And then cultural care, culturally safe care. Acknowledging Indigenous knowledge, as we talked about, giving respect and credit to those who deserve it. Sustainable harvesting practices. So respecting Indigenous people's ongoing relationship with psychedelic medicines by engaging in sustainable harvesting practices or refraining from harvesting to preserve access to Indigenous communities. Augmenting therapy tools. So this is recognizing the need to modify therapy protocols from clinical trials to increase relevancy for members of ethno-racial minorities and responding to trauma resulting from racism. So again, we talked about this a little bit a couple of weeks ago in terms of things to include in like waiting rooms and, maybe switching up the playlists that are quite standardized at this point. Maybe some of the decor in the room to be more culturally relevant or personalized to the individual. inclusive practitioner training, so enhancing cultural safety by making psychedelic assisted therapy training accessible and affordable for minority healthcare practitioners. They talked about the leading trainings in the fields of psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, particularly with MDMA and psilocybin. These are nearly $10,000 trainings. That limits who can be a part of that. And having LGBTQ plus affirming practices, so promoting cultural safety for LGBTQ plus individuals through affirming therapies and eliminating gender binary therapist teams to be more responsive to sexual minority stress. I think particularly if you're wanting to have your participants who are part of the LGBTQ community, I really think that your research team has to reflect individuals that you are wanting to recruit. And then tailored and responsive equity-oriented psychedelic therapy. So contextual training, these therapies should be tailored to specific populations and regions, considering the known social and health inequities and determinants of health relevant to each context. Prioritize addressing income-based health inequities, which have significant cross-cutting impacts with other determinants of health. So again, these intersecting pieces of a person's lived experience. Integrating psychedelic assisted therapies into public health care services or medical insurance plans to ensure equitable access based on need rather than ability to pay. Wouldn't that be nice? Balancing cost and safety, so understanding that there's a tension between safety, which again usually means more oversight, more human resources, and then cost, that will inevitably increase cost. So really what they talked about here was at this point prioritizing safety over reducing cost, to then also figure out, okay, we figured out how to make it safe. How can we keep that while also making this accessible? So in this balance right now, we're at a place of prioritizing safety, which I do think is a good place to be, and then addressing power and injustices. So this kind of care requires addressing power dynamics, racism, structural violence within and beyond healthcare systems, fostering larger change and disrupting, or larger change to disrupt these inequities. From on a micro scale, these are things that, racism, structural violence, power dynamics, to me, those should all be, you should all be able to, willing to bring those topics into the therapeutic space. So just for what it's worth, this to me goes beyond psychedelics in mental health care. If we're not talking about power dynamics, racism, structural violence, other inequities, historical influences of marginalization, then we're not seeing the whole person. And we're in many ways privileging our comfort over the therapeutic benefits of therapy. Okay, and then last but not least, we covered or talked about the inclusion of people of color in psychedelic assisted psychotherapy. They did a review of the literature. Ultimately, they found a lack of inclusion. So despite recent progress, many psychedelic studies lack diversity and representation of people of color, limiting the generalizability of findings and excluding potential therapeutic benefits for marginalized communities. So the prevalence of psychological disorders in people of color, it's probably underestimated just because of reporting and much of the stigma around even talking about any sort of diagnosis. And also, if you think about who gets diagnosed, people who have access to mental health care. So people who don't have access to it still very well might meet criteria for a diagnosis, which again could be culturally irrelevant. So these estimations that we even have now are lower. So, higher rates of PTSD for Black Americans than other populations. For generalized anxiety disorder, Hispanic Americans have a higher lifetime prevalence than any other group except for non-Hispanic whites. And OCD and depression rates, Asian Americans have similar rates of OCD and severe depression episodes compared to Black Americans, despite generally reporting lower lifetime prevalence. And then, of course, we know barriers to treatment. People of color experience significant barriers to treatment, including issues in accurate diagnosis, leading to reduced enrollment in treatment trials and higher treatment attrition rates. Inclusion of minorities in research is critical to improve treatment efficacy and effectiveness in the community. I think about this in terms of how we were screening for our psilocybin study in Alabama. You know, the individuals couldn't have a blood relative who had been diagnosed with any sort of psychotic diagnosis. And it was in many ways kind of eye-opening to me for them to be like, you know, how would I know this? Like, none of us went to the doctor to get a diagnosis for this, so I don't know. So it was also interesting in terms of even our screening was asking for information that many of our potential participants were like, what are you talking about? So symptom presentation, you know, again, I'm not going to belabor this point, but the DSM is not culturally inclusive. So there's overlooked clinical presentation because of this white dominated mental health care system. So one, individuals don't have access to treatment, but then they also, we have a very narrow view of what different symptomology manifestations are to meet criteria for, or like what these diagnoses even look like. So healthcare barriers, for example, what they talked about here was undocumented Latinos experiencing IPV face barriers in accessing mental health care services, including language, insurance, economic, and documentation status issues. Also, I mean, the extremely hostile environment that they're entering into in the United States, not dependent upon our current, like whoever is currently in office in terms of political party. So, you know, walking into an institution with the fear of, you know, deportation or something like that, like why would people walk into that? So unique factors in clinical presentation, there's external constructionist factors and intrinsic differences that contribute to difficulties in generalizing clinical trial design and recruitment, race-based trauma and PTSD, like microaggressions, aversive racism, discrimination. They induce these emotional and traumatic stress responses, but they don't necessarily meet criteria for something like PTSD, but they contribute to symptoms of depression, anxiety, and substance use. But again, if we're not talking about these things, we're not looking at the whole picture, and we're not fully treating an individual. Ethnic identity plays a crucial role in mental health, with low ethnic identity linked to poor self-esteem, adjustment issues, and substance abuse in African Americans. Mental health providers must understand and address race-related factors and incorporate ethnic identity considerations into conceptualization and treatment, which it's a specialty to do that, which to me that's not good mental health care. So in 1993, there was the NIH Revitalization Act, where they mandated adequate representation, which again is very loose, of racial minorities as well as women in research studies. And from 1993 to like 2016, we like raised the rate of inclusion of ethnic and racial minorities by like 1%. So killing it. So this act emphasizes fair recruitment strategies, hasn't panned out. Inclusion unless scientifically ruled out. So ethnic and racial minorities must be included in studies unless there is clear, significant evidence ruling out their clinical or public health importance. An increase in diversity. There has been an increase in diversity with almost 15 million minority participants in 2016 compared to approximately 1 million in 1995, which from what I understand results in about a 1% increase. So statistics, right? It depends on how you look at them. While the mandate applies to NIH funding in the US, it does not apply to private funding, and all of the funding thus far for psychedelic research is private. So results, this study looked at 18 studies that looked at, included different countries, where the majority were conducted in the US, and then Brazil, New Zealand, Switzerland, and the United Kingdom. They looked at psilocybin, ayahuasca, MDMA, ibogaine, and LSD. The studies looked at the treatment for substance use, anxiety, PTSD, and OCD. Of the 17 studies, 10 did not initially report, but then they reached out to the authors and got the results, except for the Brazilian studies, because that's like not what they do in Brazil. Like they don't even collect that data like along the way. They didn't do that. Like they weren't like, oh, we know what racial or ethnic makeup our participants were, but we didn't report it. No, they just like didn't collect it. So the final compilation included 282 participants from 16 studies between 2008 and 2017. 82.3% were non-Hispanic white, 15.7% represented people of color, including African-American, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, mixed race, and other. Always a really nice category, right? And over half were female. Non-Hispanic white participants accounted for 75 to 100% of subjects in 72.2% of all of the studies. Overall, 81.6% of psychedelic study participants were non-white Hispanic, while the average country level representation of non-white Hispanic origin is 65.4%, so they're not proportionate to the population. Across all studies, there were 18.4% of participants of color on average, comparing to country level representation of 38.2%. So again, disproportionate to the racial makeup of the country that they are a part of. So there's low representation, as we saw. The comparison to population proportions were off. A lack of data reporting. Only 10 of the 17 even reported it in the first place, had to reach out to the authors on record, but off of the publication. And so the differences in how ethnicity is defined and viewed in different countries may impact efforts to increase minority recruitment in psychedelic research. Understanding and addressing these variations are crucial for designing inclusive studies. And then future research should prioritize and collecting and reporting ethnicity data, adhering to NIH mandates for minority inclusion, and implementing strategies to increase diversity, thus improving the generalizability and effectiveness of the interventions. I did a meta-analysis of dropout rates for different substance use treatments in studies. And one of our big takeaways from our meta-analysis was the extreme inconsistency in reporting demographic data, which I do think that these should be like standard procedures for publishing, so we understand different elements of like even the study personnel, of course, demographic data, but it was very interesting. It was frustrating. It wasn't interesting. It was frustrating that how different the reporting was, that limited our understanding of the studies, because ultimately what we were trying to understand was, what is the average dropout rate in substance use treatment, and then what factors might influence that. And when we don't give sufficient methodological information, particularly things like, years of experience of the treatment team, demographic information of the treatment team, that also, I think, limits our ability to understand what was efficacious in the treatments. So some possible explanation: a lack of cultural inclusivity. The DSM-5, even text revised, this was done when the DSM-5 was out, doesn't account for cultural variations. Without culturally inclusive criteria, minorities may not qualify for treatments, hindering their representation. The primary recruitment method was referrals from outpatient providers. So think about the systemic inequities there of insurance, ability to afford outpatient services. So if they're they're getting referrals from outpatient providers, they're going to get a potentially homogeneous sample, which is generally what happens. a lack of diversity among researchers. We talked about that. Historical injustices. I talked about the Tuskegee syphilis study. So when you think about this, you know, they said, hey, I'm giving you a beneficial treatment, and they gave them syphilis. So if I'm saying, hey, here's something that you might not be exposed to, familiar with, trust me, just take it. I can understand why someone would be like, nah, I'm good. And then addressing the issue to increase minority representation, the research community should embrace cultural inclusivity and diagnostic criteria. Again, so this is, the DSM is research-based. So again, think about who is a part of research. You know, and it takes a long time to make changes to the DSM. Whoa. My watch just talked to me. Implement effective and diverse recruitment strategies, increase diversity among researchers, and build trust through transparent and respectful engagement within minority communities. So current efforts, there are some being made. Of note is MAPS. They're actively addressing inequities by acknowledging the importance of race-based trauma and PTSD treatment. They're working with study staff to increase minority recruitment for their current phase 3 clinical trial. They are including the addition of sites focused on recruiting subjects who have experienced race-based trauma. There are international conferences on psychedelics that are making efforts to be more inclusive by featuring panel discussions and guest lectures from Indigenous healers and people of color. These initiatives aim to acknowledge and tackle current inequities. These efforts are promising. They're a promising start. They represent only the beginning. So you know, there's a trajectory that is hopeful and positive, but we have to stay vigilant. Beyond recruitment, it's crucial to involve people of color and Indigenous communities in all aspects of research. Again, this is where that community-based research is important. And also, you know, recruiting, if we think about this, who's doing research? Institutions. Who conducts the research? Faculty members. So we need representation in institutions as well. And, you know, how are we recruiting our faculty? So there's so many layers to this that contribute to the current state that we're in terms of psychedelics and the homogeneity. So including study design, implementation, and dissemination of findings, building trust and meaningful engagement is essential to addressing historical injustices and current disparities. Then having a collective responsibility. The entire psychedelic research community, including researchers, institutions, funders, policymakers, need to take collective responsibility in driving forward efforts to increase diversity and inclusion in psychedelic medicine. This collaboration and cooperation will be key to ensuring equitable access and benefits for all populations. So addressing inequities, the current image of psychedelic community often portrays white affluence, leading to low representation, and quite frankly, probably feeling like this isn't for me, right? People don't look like me. Why and how would I want to be a part of that? Acknowledging the historical bias. So the glorification of white hippies in the 60s and 70s has contributed to the underrepresentation of minorities in the research, perpetuating biases and stereotypes. Culturally inclusive environments, we should, as researchers, create these environments during study visits, including diverse artwork, music, and language. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, to help minority participants feel more comfortable and welcomed. There is an economic burden. So again, think about what I was talking about with MDMA and psilocybin. These are in full days that they have to be in the lab, where they have to take time off work. They potentially have to pay for childcare. You know, how are we compensating individuals for being part of this? And how are we incentivizing individuals to see that this is something that could be not only beneficial for the scientific community, which that is not of participants' concern, nor it should be, but how do the benefits of this study outweigh the burden? And so I think an answer to that is adequate compensation. So there's a stigma of drug use, which psychedelics are a drug, coupled with discriminatory law enforcement practices. This may deter minority participation. I cannot tell you how many participants asked us, does psilocybin show up on a drug test? Because many of them were in what's called TASC. It's like an alternative to being incarcerated, or it's an alternative to incarceration where they were being drug tested regularly. So that was something that we had to reassure them. We also had to talk to TASC, TASC individuals to make sure that they were aware of who was in the study, and that, which compromised some of the confidentiality, but our participants cleared it anyway. So there's just challenges and stigmas that affect inclusivity. And then there's some complex factors. The lack of minority inclusion in psychedelic medicine is a complex issue that requires conscious efforts from those with power to rectify past injustices and promote diversity in the research. And then what I want to leave you with on this presentation is, we will call it Paula. So I want you to reflect on this story and give space to your own thoughts, feelings, responses about it, because it's disheartening. It's a story about the realities of the commercialization, pharmaceuticalization, scaling, monetization, medicalization of this field. And I want to give you permission to give yourself space to just kind of reflect on that. And of course, include it in your reflection if you would like. All right, y'all. Thank you for hopefully what was a good semester for you. I very much look forward to your feedback on the semester, and very open to any feedback on improvements. I am already very aware of the burden of the therapist interview. I apologize for the stress that created in many of you. And that is something that, you're kind of the testers of this class. And I have 3 sections of this class, so I have 90 of you in total that are enrolled in this course. So, just trying to navigate, making sure that I'm giving adequate attention to the students, but also giving you not the students, to you, and also giving you a good experience in terms of the materials that I've provided you. So very much open to your feedback. If you want to give any to me outside of the end of the semester evaluations, I am all ears. And so I appreciate you being a part of this class with me this semester.